Hello, everyone, and welcome to America's Wilderness Years. Today, we're going to be talking about two big stories: Zohran Mamdani getting elected in the New York mayoral primaries, and the big, beautiful bill getting passed through the Senate. So, Isaac, give us a rundown of what's happened in the Senate and what exactly is in this massive budget bill right now.
So we've been following the big beautiful bill for a while. We've talked about lots of different things that have been in it and lots of stuff that was supposed to be cut but didn't get cut because in the process of trying to get this through the Senate, a lot of the more controversial cuts had to be removed to satisfy the votes that were necessary, which has kind of angered a lot of the more aggressive, fiscal, responsible Republicans. And the main body of this bill is primarily massive tax cuts, which primarily benefit the most wealthy in America. So it's about, more than 60% are going to be going to the richest people in America. And to try and make up for this, they want to make cuts in the budget, but you can't just cut the park services, which they've already done. Instead, you need to get into the two biggest line items in the US budget, which is either going to be Social Security or defense. And with defense out of the picture, that means cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. And the administration has really just transparently said we're not going to make these cuts. These are not happening. And then has said these are the cuts that's going to happen. So publicly they're just lying. They're just very transparently lying about it. And the real story that is developed out of this and something that they've been very terrified to talk about, and you see them go on TV and when they have to explain what's in the bill, is the fact that nonpartisan analysts have warned that these cuts to Medicaid, which is going to happen, and these cuts to Medicaid, which are going to happen, is likely going to strip somewhere around 12 million Americans from access to healthcare in the years to come. And as much as the administration is trying to cover up what's actually in their budget bill, more than 50% of voters generally oppose what's in the big beautiful bill, and only about 30% actually support the big beautiful bill. And this level of support for the bill is basically correlated with how much you don't know about it in other polling. So at the end of the day, this bill was incredibly controversial, and JD Vance was the deciding vote because the Republican Senate is the majority is the Republican Senate, which had 53 legislators, and it was a tie 50 to 50 with JD Vance as the vice president stepping in. And despite what the administration says, this budget is going to increase the overall deficit, with most independent analysts putting the increase in deficit in the next few years around $3.3 trillion, with the debt ceiling being raised by a further $5 trillion in case we need to spend even more money going forwards.
Yikes, that's it's a lot more interest we're going to have to be paying. Oh
Yeah,
boy.
hopefully we can take out loans to pay off our interest going forwards. This could be our great French Revolutionary moment. On the topic of the French Revolution, we should probably talk a little bit about what happened in New York City last week.
Yeah, there was a pretty big upset in the Democratic primaries for their mayoral candidate. The expected winner, Andrew Cuomo, who is the former governor of New York State, did not win in the first round of voting. Instead, Zohran Mamdani, who is a Democratic Socialist, Bernie aligned type, won with 44% of the vote compared to Cuomo's 36% of the votes among Democrats. And Cuomo, who is, much more widely recognizable face, not necessarily for the best reasons, mind you,
Yeah.
expected to win initially with over 50% of the votes, which would just mean he would win outright. But because he failed to do this, he just conceded the race to Mamdani.
And it really was incredible because the way that these voting processes work, which is New York City has ranked choice voting, is that each round you basically eliminate whoever didn't get enough votes to continue. So you slowly pile up votes until you get someone who has the majority they need to win. But Mamdani won with this in the first round with the same amount Eric Adams won in his final round. So the level of turnout and support from Mamdani was incredible, and this largely was a grassroots campaign where he was leveraging a lot of social media, and he is a serious populist, maybe in a way that even Bernie Sanders wasn't. Yeah, and with such a big blowout, and for such a prominent city, it's a really interesting moment of reflection within the Democratic Party, and their more sort of establishment candidate did lose, and he lost to a more radical candidate in the case of Mamdani, who does support stuff like rent freezes and free buses.
Yeah, I've taken a little bit of a look at his platform, and I don't necessarily think it'll work, but there's some interesting ideas there, and New York is certainly a big testing ground for that.
Yeah, it's so the big takeaway from his policies is that it's all about price of living, cost of living in New York City, which has gotten incredibly out of hand. So
Yeah,
stuff like thinking about city-run grocery stores, because most New Yorkers overwhelmingly think that the prices are too high for groceries. The idea of having free public transit, which yes, there's no such thing as a free lunch, but actually the transit, like these bus fares, all the money that is paid into them turns out more value. So theoretically, you're still making a net gain. Although I think there's some issues in terms of the tragedy of the commons, which is, what do people use free stuff for? They often don't. They often don't use it for the same thing. But he's also talking about like rent freezing, which is his main number one policy, which is sort of freezing rent on rent stabilized housing, which is something that Eric Adams failed to do, as well as cracking down on landlords who are too harsh on their renters. So it's a very interesting program focused on like I'm very bread and butter issues and coming at it from a very far left standpoint from where America normally is at, which I think is why the Democrats were super hesitant for people like Hakeem Jeffries to actually like endorse him in that. But he did win. So as much as I think you're right to be skeptical about how his program will work out. I think there's a lot of interest in trying that. And I think that's one of the big takeaways is the idea of sort of a socialist running New York as one of those 1920s tabloids that would be the end of the world. There's another thing I want to focus on because I've listened to a lot of like commentators that I respect, but who are from an older generation. And I think there's been a real outpouring of very serious like anti-Muslim discrimination against Mamdani since his election in like a very transparent way on social media about how he represents these like all white districts, but he's not because Mamdani is he was born in Uganda. He's the son of Indian Muslims, so he has this incredible story growing up in New York and being connected to all of this. And as a city, as like a representative of the city on a lower level, he always fought for these sorts of things in a very populist way. But the way he's been treated is really incredible. And like you even had Trump in a press conference a couple of days ago saying that he was thinking about maybe throwing Mamdani in jail. Mamdani is a communist, not a socialist. And it's really incredible as a lightning rod. And I think also as much as people say, oh, this is bad because it is extremism and there's something to that. I do think this is kind of what people wanted to see. They wanted to see a Democrat who actually gets people's attention, who feels like he's doing something new.
yeah. The Democratic establishment is really going to be keeping an eye on Mondani's situation in the future because they probably don't want to do a lot of the things that he wants to do, but at some point they're going to have to acknowledge if he does succeed in any way. They're going to have to figure out how populist do we need to be to survive in this political climate.
Well, yeah, but I also think there's also a lot of room for like the Trump administration, unironically, in the weirdest way, does run on these basic, butter and guns issues. They just don't solve any of them. They just say we're gonna get all
Yeah.
your jobs back, and then you just lose all your jobs. And I think the idea of having this as an experiment that we can learn from is very valuable. And if he succeeds or if he fails, and he still has to get actually elected, so how he makes that work is really incredible. But I remember just thinking about the optimist side of what's going on. I remember coming home when this news was broken and talking to my aunt, and she said, there's only one piece of good news this week, and it was this. And I think I think a lot of people have been pleasantly surprised by this because the idea of the Democratic Party as being this slow, stagnant thing that won't move or do anything. And now, we see a young guy and a young guy from a non-traditional background coming in on issues that New Yorkers do care about. New Yorkers do support rent freezes on rent stabilized housing, which is a crazy policy. And like, don't get me wrong, manipulating prices always gets messy, but all of these policies actually do have a large amount of support. So seeing that experiment in action, I think it'll be very intriguing to going forwards.
Absolutely. Gonna have to keep an eye on it.
Just like the big beautiful bill, and that's one of the themes we always hit on in America's wilderness years is that you can just see the headlines, but if you can get beyond them, you'll see a lot more trends. You'll see that Trump has been cooking on stuff like the big beautiful bill for a while now, and we also see that there is an impatience with the Democratic Party, and we saw that when Gavin Newsom was sparring with Trump. And where Mamdani falls in all of this, and if the big beautiful bill passes in its current form, this is not. Neither of these stories are the end of these trends. They're just the continuation of it.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that Mamdani's election signifies is that America isn't as Zionist as it used to be, or at least just firmly pro-Zionist, because Mamdani has spoken on the issue of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and he's pretty condemnative of Israel actions. So it shows that if Americans aren't necessarily, even though Americans aren't necessarily pro-Palestine, not like all the people who voted for him are pro-Palestine, they're at the very least not seeing it as a deal breaker, you know?
Yeah, I think there's. Well, I mean, to be fair, I'd actually say that most Americans consistently, including American Muslims, are pro two-state solution. So, and it's also worth noting the amount he had to answer questions as as a potential mayor about foreign policy is incredible. Like,
Yeah.
he's like everyone when they were asking like, "Where's your first trip to out of country going to be?" to everyone, and he just said, "I'm not leaving New York. I'm gonna stay here and help people." And then everyone's like, "I'm gonna go to Ukraine. I'm gonna go to Israel." I just think people are more focused on. We talked about this before, which is people don't really care about foreign policy. Like we talked about this from the Zelensky thing. The Zelensky thing was one of these big breakthroughs, and as divisive as that was, I think a lot of people's understanding of the Middle East has really changed in the past couple of years since October 7th. And I think that that's enabled new opportunities, and it's also really opened space for a lot more anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim discrimination. I think part of that is what we're seeing here is anti-Muslim discrimination against him, and the sort of like, and we also see this in other schools, which are now getting investigated for not doing enough to protect anti-Semitism. And I think it's a really interesting point, especially because New York City has a very strong sort of like Jewish community, and where all of that will fall, how all that will fall in is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, he's gonna have to be going up against what, Eric Adams and some guy with a Slavic name, I think. The Republican candidate, I think his name looked Polish or something. I don't know. And
Wow, we already are going back to 1920s discrimination. He was one of the I can't remember, no, the guys that fucking the I can't remember what they're called, the New York Angels,
oh,
like the guys who do bus security. Oh no, it's Curtis Sliwa and Eric Adams, the hero. Listen, Eric Adams is the greatest mayor of Ankara we've ever had. Yeah, he's running against Curtis Sliwa, who is a former guardian angel, which is sort of like these volunteer public transport security. So like he's very if he has one thing going for him, which I'm gonna be honest, I don't think anyone in the U.S. knows who he is that he would wear like this red. He wears this like red beret when he goes
oh,
on the news. But he has an uphill battle, and I'm seriously skeptical about his chances. So it's very interesting that a lot of things are up in the air because Eric Adams, who is a former mayor, as we discussed, was both famously corrupt in a way that is in the highest tradition of New York City, like getting private money from the
yeah,
Turks, that sort of thing, trying to sell.
absolutely, absolutely legendary scumbag. You're like,
It was really impressive, like, when they had him go into his room in New York because he has to prove his residency, and there's, like, all the curtains are shut. It's, like, completely desolate when he comes in. There's, like, a dresser in front of his window. It's, like, it's the most obvious thing he doesn't live there, and, like, I think he has that problem, which is he must have immediately because he was a former police officer. Well, I guess he must have just thought every speech he was giving would be the most important speech ever, because every time he had to go to these ethnic events, he had the exact same thing. He would say, "This is the Kyiv of America. This is the Greb of America. New York City is the Brussels of America. New York City is the New Delhi of America." And no, I'm kidding. There's like 20 every single event he went to, he would give this same speech about how New York City is the capital of whatever.